my other thought was, what if it's more or less just like almost kind of like a remote viewing of time? You go there and it's, kind of like oh, what's that movie? Um, with Scrooge, where, he goes and visits the
Oh,
time,
yeah.
but he can't
Scrooge,
interact
or
with them or
yeah,
anything.
Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol.
Christmas Carol, that was the one I was thinking of.
Well, the
But
one you're talking about with Alfred Finney, or Albert Finney,
hmm
that's just called Scrooge,
oh yeah.
from like 1970, 1975, something like that.
Anyways, what if you just have no interaction? It's only knowledge that you're literally gaining from that
Well,
interaction with the
yeah, I
other
really
time
appreciate what you're
reality.
saying there, because if you were able to sit down, concentrate, whatever, remove consciousness and go back in time or go forward in time, people say, well, that would be dangerous because then you'd have manipulative people messing with the timeline or getting whatever they want, or whatever. You have these other stories that come about because of that. But if you're an individual that actually accomplishes that, what's the point of changing stuff around? You just time traveled. There are far bigger things to think about or to experience. And I think if you were to get to that point, you're already thinking of different things. You're not thinking of world domination. You're not thinking of, changing the outcome of a war. You're not thinking
Yeah.
about, making a huge bet on a horse race so you can be a millionaire. Your thoughts aren't on that spectrum anymore, especially if you're able to make it to that point, to get your ego and conscious in a certain space to be removed from this area and transport yourself to another, or remote view another. Your concerns are got to be totally different. Your mind makeup, things that you think about on a daily basis, and goals that you may have as an individual have to be far different than, well, I'm going to go back in time and change this, or I'm going to go forward in time and see what happens. Because I think if you were to even go forward in time, the future that you would see, it
It's only
doesn't mean that
possible.
it's a future that is going to happen. It's just a uh, probab probability, like seeing into the future is something, it's really hard for us to comprehend, because you have like the butterfly effect. So if you were to go into the future, doesn't that mess up the future just by going into it? you know is there even a future? Like, is there
Right.
even
So
past?
I
Or is it just recorded information, recorded energy, or different frequencies?
I kind of might have stumbled across some really interesting connections. I mean, so if you technically time travel and go across, a different reality, and you're on these different planes of mind, and you separate yourself from basically that common space that we were talking about earlier, does time travel technically break down the ego?
Well, you
I
can't
mean,
think of
it
yourself like, if you're entering the past or entering the future, or, I mean, you really can't like establish yourself. You can't be so into your. I would assume that you're probably right, Zach. You'd have to, you it does destroy the ego, because you're now resonating with that frequency of the planet, or that frequency of that space, right? You're almost letting go of the ego in order to experience the fabric of the universe, I suppose, the fabric of this space. Is
hmm
that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Just how you're talking about, separating yourself from you have completely different thoughts. You're not going to try to world dominate. That's very egotistical.
Or
Well, I think it gets I think it gets a little bit deeper, or there's more that we need to kind of flesh out here with the idea. Obviously, with the time travel we're talking about, we're not talking about you getting inside of a phone booth or a DeLorean or anything, hitting 88
Obviously.
miles an hour and going somewhere, right? And then bringing your body, right? That's much more of that ego self. We're talking about essentially remote viewing that displaces you throughout time or these multiple realities. So in essence, the maximum you have to be able to affect your that reality you're observing could maybe at the most be through your astral self, I guess you could call, right? You know, if you look into people who say they astral travel or into those different types of things, they can interact with stuff and move about. They've got an astral body, right? But they're still not fully there to be able to 100% interact with that reality outside of their astral self, correct? So I think when we're talking about this time travel, how could you even change things if you're just moving your consciousness forwards and backwards or around throughout?
And
Um,
and maybe it's actually
Go
not
ahead.
letting go of the ego. Maybe it's actually using the ego to identify with those things. Because, like in our last video, we said we add all these things to our ego, right? We add the flair. We add all these things to our ego to resonate in this space. You know, whether it's my job, my family, you know, my favorite foods, the things I like to do. You know, we add all these things, make this avatar, and now we're a person, right? Now we're a person here in this realm. And maybe it's not actually letting go of the ego, it's just taking that ego and identifying with these other things. So if my ego, I'm adding a thirst for understanding, or I'm wanting to
Right.
equalize myself with the fabric of the universe, maybe that's what it is it's actually resonating your ego with all of these things, with all the things that you don't understand. And maybe that's what it is. Because if we get rid of the ego, separate the ego, then I think you're just energy. You're probably just
Well, and
energy.
well, exactly. If you per se you spent your whole life just remote viewing time, I mean, at what point have you basically stopped existing as a person and you're literally just a remote viewer that is just energy? You know what I mean?
Jake?
yeah, well, I remember reading this years back, back when I actually had a Facebook, but that's besides the point. It was a really cool article about this Buddhist monk who has been reportedly meditating for over 200 years, right? And they show you photos. It basically looks like a mummified dude, right? He's pretty much a skeleton, just in, Buddhist robes, sitting in almost a perfect lotus pose, right? And the story goes that that monk in that specific, monastery or temple, he's been he went into a meditation state, right, to say where he was, being enlightened and moving towards, astral traveling and experiencing more of the world outside of his body, right, through meditation. And he had been doing it for so long, but no one wanted to do anything. Like, we're not going to mess up this guy's meditation, right? They're monks. They're obviously not going to do that. And this guy just continued to meditate. Whether or not his he actually died, who's to say? He could have totally just left his body and is out going around everywhere experiencing multiple dimensions. Who really knows? But his body is still where it was 200 years ago, just sitting there. They've embalmed it and they're just saying his body's here. If he ever wants to come back, he will come back to his body. But so far as we know, he's never come back. And so there's just been this monk dude, this body possibly just sitting there for over 200 years, which to me goes to like what Zach said there. Like, once you enable that ability, right? Once you're no longer tethered to the ego of this reality, right? Wouldn't you want to just leave that and spend the rest of your time as that energy source, right? Moving about, and who knows what you're really doing at that point? Can we even really comprehend it in this training wheels reality that Max was talking about?
I'm not. I'm not sure, and I think you're when you get into that kind of situation, it's like, well, what are your motives? I don't understand monk lifestyle. I've never been, you know, to visit any situation like that or spoken to anyone personally. So I have no credence to talk about what that's all about. But I do know that they hold outside factors much more dear to them than feeding the internal wants and needs. They hold outside forces up to a higher stature than this force. You know, here in the Western world, we hold this as the most important thing. You know, and let all of
Mm-hmm.
that outside, whatever happens, but this is the most important thing. You know, in their world, this is probably the least important thing to be concerned about. You know, it's everything else that's going
Yup.
on. And I'm not saying if you were ever to gain that skill and figure out how to leave, I'm not saying that you would just peace out and not want to, experience this realm anymore. I'm just saying that it would be different. You know, it's not, you don't have the same consciousness, you don't have the same problems, or you don't have you. It's just it's not even comparable, because
It's like, how people say first world problems, right? These small issues that, you know, people sometimes make out to be a big deal. I feel like, yeah, when what you're saying is once your consciousness is raised enough to where you're no longer living through that ego, right? Whether you be a monk or however you go about it. If you're no longer, focusing on that space and you're focusing on things beyond that, the this three-dimensional reality that we have starts to seem like small potatoes, right? If you could remote view the future or the past and move your consciousness throughout that sliding plane, like these menial things like, oh, what am I gonna have for breakfast? Really just seems like, why do I even care? I'm an energetic, you know, piece of frequency and consciousness that can move about realities. Breakfast is the least of your worries.
right. And that to that same point, breakfast being the least of your worries, it's like if you were to understand this knowledge and you had this ability to move about, the world in a different way. It's like when you would interact with someone and they'd say, well, I've got this problem or this, and that individual will look at them and understand, like, I don't live here. Like, I don't live in this world that you live in, but I understand what you're going through and I understand where your ego's at. So they interact with you in that structure that you can understand. That doesn't mean they're one of you. It just means they're here in this
Mm-hmm.
state. They understand what you're going through, where you live, and they resonate with you in order to maintain a relationship of some kind. It's like, I guess a example would be like if we take a child, right, and we take an adult, and the child um, has this toy. He's playing imagination I get using his imagination to play action figure and action figure, and comes up to his dad and says, "This is what's going on. This is what's happening." And the dad gets involved and says, "Yeah, let's, and they make a reality of it, right? A thing of it." Now the dad doesn't live in that world, but he resonates with him
Yup.
in order to maintain that relationship. Now some parents would say that's not real, don't believe it. And some parents will get involved and allow that imagination to go forward. So that's at that point where a child's imagination, is it fake? Is it really just made up? Or because they haven't been exposed to so much people structuring their reality, that they're that powerful to create that different bubble that's going on. Like that stuff, like when you're imagining as a child and doing that, you're so involved. You are so involved and so captivated by what's going on, and it is not the same as when you're an adult who has been, their imagination is almost gone at that point. So that's how I would feel if, just stupid example, if I was to all of a sudden become really good at understanding where I'm at, and I could just float away, get my consciousness to come out, and then I could come back. I would walk around understanding that people are still in this state. And like there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can tell anybody to explain it. There's nothing I can do to change. And people say, well, why don't you save the world? Why don't you go back in time and do this? Why don't I? And when you think of it that way, you're like, well, all I'm doing is sufficing another person's ego. If I was to go back in time and stop Hitler, well, all I'm doing is sufficing someone else's ideas or goals. That's pointless at that point. The real point that I'm getting at is, if you are able to experience that, you realize that this world that everybody else is living in it's just not yours anymore. And if you're going to be in it, you just have to understand that people are still in it, right? People are still in it.
Yup.
And the only thing you can do is just live by example and try to be like the most positive you could be, or do things that would help people advance their consciousness, their heart, who they are, like happiness, like taking that on. You're not concerned about events at that point. You're concerned about perception, like how people perceive things, because it is kind of a stuck reality. Like if you're only about ego and you believe that only the physical exists and that only this life is all I have, it's a cell. It's a jail cell.
It is.
So that's just always been a really interesting thought to me, is if there was anybody who ever made it beyond this, their goals, they're not movie theatrical goals that we see in film. They're not egotistical goals, that we would read about in, a crazy thriller book or, something like that. And it's not what NASA provides either with, I don't think anyways, with wormholes and, even though there might be some credence to some of those physical things in space, but there's too much going on in the conscious to just say, well, it's just you. It's just your conscious. Like, we don't get it. We don't understand it. It's there. And then when you die, it's gone. But we don't even know if it's gone when you die. You know what I'm saying? So I think the more an individual works on that to see where it actually goes, you're going to see totally different things for sure. And I'm starting to lose track of what I'm even talking about because it gets so dang confusing. Like it gets and it's really difficult to like explain to another individual what you're even trying to get across. Like, what do you mean? astral project or leave your body, and you always have these visions, like these visual aids in your head of like a ghost shell coming out of your body, like, you know, this person stepping out and looking down at yourself. And it's like, no, I don't even think it's that. I think it's still present tense, and you're just not here. You're just not in the same space everybody else is in. But you see the space that everybody else is in. But
Yeah.
you're interacting in it, but you're not there. Like it's like it's like
It's trying to explain or try to describe what like an orange looks like to a blind person who's never seen an orange.
yeah, I mean it's yeah, it's incredibly it's incredibly hard to. It's like if you were to put, you know what they're doing now with sports, and they're putting like cameras in the stands, and people can virtually buy a ticket and like sit in the stands with like a VR headset.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
so you
That's
wear
kind
a
of
VR
cool.
headset, and it's like you're at the
Yep.
game. You know, you can look around and whatever from your seat. It's kind of like that. It's like once you get to the point to like be outside of yourself, it'd be like everyone thinks you're here, but you're really just interacting like it's so hard because you got it's so hard.
I
Okay,
I
so
really like.
what you're saying, what you're saying is, as opposed to, like, let's say I was to sit here, right, and remove my consciousness, go back to see the dinosaurs, right? That's my plan. So I remove my consciousness and travel back in time, as opposed to my consciousness coming up out of me and traveling whichever direction is the past, right? That is probably not even a direction. What you're saying is that instead you're replacing the reality around you. Your consciousness is shifting the reality to that time period. You're not displacing yourself, you're displacing reality around you, right? Is that kind of more what
Yeah,
you're
because
getting at?
you
That you're there, but your consciousness has shifted the space so that your consciousness is operating in a different reality. Your body is still in the common
right.
space. Your body stays in the common space, and that's what everybody sees. But you yourself, from your soul perspective, right? Your consciousness is perceiving a different
Right,
timeline.
right, exactly. That's what, yeah, that's exactly where I was getting at. Like, if I'm here, I'm talking to you, and we're on a subject, and you're like, well, how do you really think about that? And you're like, well, I don't really care because I don't live in this world. I don't
I
live here. I'm
no,
not
I'm
concerned
not.
with that. But I'll dabble in talking to you about it. While in the meantime, I'm off exploring something totally different that's not even remotely close to this, and it's unexplainable to you because you're in this world exclusively.